desperately tied her hands like she was some outlaw. Dirt on her cheeks, hair matted, eyes burning with quiet fire. No one wanted her, not even for $1, until a quiet rancher stepped forward with a few coins and claimed her. What came next? No one in that town would ever forget. Some stories ain't in the history books, but if you want more tales like this from the dusty trails, make sure you subscribe, partner. We got plenty more where this came from. The summer heat clung to the dusty air like sweat on a sinner's back, heavy and unforgiving. The town of Whetstone Hollow hadn't seen rain in weeks, and the people were just as dry, bitter, cracked, hardened by wind and want. It was market day, but something else had drawn the crowd to the wooden stage near the center of town. Not livestock, not grain, not horses. No, this time it was something, or rather, someone, far more pitiful. She stood on that creaking platform with her hands bound in front of her by rough rope, the kind they usually reserved for thieves. Her dress was once white, now gray with dirt and stained with sweat. Strands of dark hair clung to her cheeks, matted against the grime. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't look up, just stared at the ground like she already knew what she was worth to these people. Nothing. 5 cents to anyone who'll take her off our hands, barked a tall man in a bowler hat, the self-appointed auctioneer. He wore a grin too wide and eyes too empty. She eats more than she works, curses when she talks at all, and might be cursed herself, for all we know. Anyone? The crowd chuckled. A woman near the front crossed her arms and muttered, "Heard she was found near the old well, talking to herself. Ain't natural." Another voice rang out, a man with tobacco stains on his teeth. "Might be better off shooting her than feeding her." Laughter rose like smoke. No one saw a woman. They saw burden, shame, waste. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Just stood there, silent and still, like stone that had been stepped on too many times to care anymore. The auctioneer scratched the back of his neck, now looking mildly annoyed. No takers? Not even for a penny? A few men tossed glances at each other. One spat on the ground. "She ain't worth a damn cent." The air shifted then, quietly. Without sound or fanfare, a man stepped forward from the crowd. He wasn't known by name to most, but everyone recognized the coat. Brown oilskin, torn at the elbow, and the hat pulled low over his brow. He'd been coming to town for years, trading supplies, buying tools, never staying long enough to speak more than a few words. Folks said he lived out past Devil's Hollow, alone on land that no one wanted. They called him the Widow Rancher, though no one ever confirmed if he'd really lost a wife or if that was just another story folks made up to explain a quiet man. He didn't speak now either, just reached into his coat and pulled out a few tarnished coins, maybe 15, 20 cents at most, and tossed them at the auctioneer's feet. The crowd stared. For a second, silence swallowed the square. The auctioneer blinked. You serious, mister?" The man didn't answer, just stepped up to the platform, slow and steady, like time didn't matter. He climbed the steps, took hold of the frayed rope still tying her wrists, and gave it a soft tug. Not rough, not forceful, just enough to tell her, "You're coming with me now." From the crowd, someone called out, "She ain't worth that much." Another laughed. "You trying to fix a broken mule with ghost eyes?" But he didn't react, didn't turn, didn't flinch, just kept walking, leading her down the steps and through the middle of the crowd like they weren't even there. She followed without a word, no resistance, no glance behind, only the faintest shift in her expression, like a candle trying to decide whether to die or burn a little longer. Behind them, the laughter faded. Whispers replaced it. Questions, suspicion. But the man and the woman, one forgotten, one feared, walked into the sunlight like shadows being reclaimed by the day. They reached his horse, an old chestnut mare with kind eyes, tied up near the saloon. He untied the rope binding her wrists with calloused fingers, careful not to hurt her. She rubbed her wrists, looking at him now, really looking, searching for cruelty, expecting it even. But he didn't offer any, just reached into his saddlebag and handed her a canteen of water. No words, no orders. Just a quiet gesture, as if he wasn't rescuing her, just treating her like a person. She took it, hesitated, then drank. They mounted up, him in front, rein steady, and her behind, clinging with hands that trembled just slightly, like a bird testing the air before it dares to fly. And then, without a backward glance, they rode away from Whetstone Hollow. The town that had laughed, the town that had judged, the town that had thrown her away like old bones from a dry stew pot. No one knew her name, not yet. And no one knew what she carried inside her, what secrets, what story, what weight. But the man who had paid pennies for her. He would soon find out that she wasn't just broken. She was hiding something worth more than the whole damn town. The land stretched out before them like an old, torn quilt. Dry patches of yellowed grass stitched between wind-bitten ridges and long stretches of nothing. Dust rose behind the horses' hooves, catching the sun in slow, swirling columns that shimmered like ghosts. The town had disappeared behind them, swallowed by the heat haze, but she didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, hands gripping the saddle horn as the horse carried them farther into the wild. The man hadn't said a word since they left Whetstone Hollow. Not one. Just rode with a calm, steady hand on the reins, his hat tipped low against the sun. She sat behind him, close enough to feel the shift of his muscles as they moved, but still not close enough to feel safe. Silence hung heavy between them, like a thick fog that neither of them dared cut through. She didn't know what to expect, only what she'd seen before. Some men who bought women didn't want wives. They wanted workers, or worse. Her stomach stayed tight with dread, a knot of old memories and fresh uncertainty. She'd been traded like goods once before. She knew how the story usually ended. But this time, it was different. When the horse slowed near a dry creek bed, he swung off first and reached into his saddlebag. Without looking at her, he handed up a piece of jerky and the same canteen from earlier. No words, no demand, just a simple offering, like he was sharing food with a stranger on the trail. Nothing more, nothing less. She took them cautiously and ate. He didn't watch her, didn't leer, didn't smile. He just sat on a rock a few feet away, eyes on the horizon, as if he wasn't thinking about her at all. Or maybe he was. Maybe he was thinking too much and didn't know how to speak it. After a while, he stood, dusted his coat, and mounted up again. She handed back the canteen, and they rode on. The sun dipped lower, casting everything in long shadows and molten light. The trail curved up a small rise, and when they crested it, she finally saw where they were heading. Below them, in a shallow valley framed by broken fence posts and wild sage, sat a ranch, or what was left of one. The main house leaned slightly to the left, like time had pushed it too hard. Its white paint had long since peeled to gray. A small barn stood beside it, door half-hanging on rusted hinges. A well sat between them, its old wooden frame wrapped in climbing weeds. Chickens scratched in the dust. A single mule lifted its head and brayed lazily from behind a crooked fence. It was a place long forgotten by the world. But something about it, something in the way the grass still dared to grow along the path, or how smoke gently curled from the crooked chimney, felt almost alive, like it was waiting to be noticed again. They reached the gate, and he dismounted without help. She slid down behind him, her legs stiff from the ride. He walked ahead, opening the gate and motioning toward the house with a simple tilt of his head. No force, no words, just invitation. She followed. Inside, the house smelled of old wood, coffee grounds, and something faintly floral. Dried lavender, maybe, tucked into corners long ago. The furniture was simple. A rocking chair, a narrow table, 2 mismatched chairs. A quilt hung over the back of a worn settee. Everything had a layer of dust, but nothing was cruel. Nothing said, "You're mine now." He moved toward the hearth and stoked the dying coals. When the fire caught, he turned to her and pointed toward a room down the hall. She stepped inside and found a bed. A real one. Small but clean. A folded blanket lay on top, a pitcher of water beside it, a tin basin on the floor. She stared at it all, unsure what to do. Was this hers? She waited, expecting him to follow, to shut the door, to make a demand, but he didn't. She turned and saw him still standing in the hallway, hat in his hands, like he was waiting for permission in his own house. And then she noticed something. The way he leaned, the subtle hitch in his stance. His right leg. It shook slightly. Not enough for most to notice, but she'd seen it before. A limp, a wound, old pain that never quite healed. She looked at his hands next, scarred, calloused. A man who'd worked too hard for too long. He wasn't whole either. She whispered, almost afraid to break the quiet. "Why did you take me?" He blinked, met her eyes for the first time since they left town. Then, in a voice low and rough like gravel under wagon wheels, he said, "Because no one else did." And with that, he tipped his hat, turned, and walked away, leaving her with a bed to sleep in and questions she wasn't ready to ask out loud. The night fell slow and quiet, wrapping the broken ranch in a blanket of stars. Somewhere out there, coyotes howled. The wind kissed the dry earth. And a woman no one wanted tried to believe, just maybe, that kindness didn't always come with a price. The first morning came quiet, with no rooster, no bell, just the rustle of dry wind slipping through the cracks in the old cabin walls. She woke with her fingers still curled around the blanket he'd left folded for her. Stiff from years of wear, but warm, with a kindness that still lingered. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the tin basin, the chipped pitcher of water, and the shaft of light pouring through the crooked shutters. She sat up slowly, listening for footsteps. There were none. Just the crackling of a fire being tended in the main room, soft and methodical. She rose, splashed water on her face, braided her tangled hair, and stepped out into the cabin. He was there by the hearth, crouched low, feeding the flames like he'd been doing it for decades. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just stood, wiped his hands on his coat, and walked out the front door. A man made of silence and shadow. She looked around the room. Dust danced in the sunlight that sliced through the warped windows. The place was tired, like the bones of an old man waiting to be remembered. But she saw more than neglect. She saw a home, or the ghost of one. Without asking, she began to clean. She gathered a cloth, dipped it in the basin, and wiped the table. Scrubbed the soot from the mantel, swept the floor, coaxing dust bunnies from corners where they'd settled in like squatters. She opened the shutters and let the morning light pour in, chasing shadows from the corners. By noon, she was in the small kitchen, building a stew from what little she found in the larder. Beans, onions, a single shriveled potato. She didn't know if he'd eat it, didn't know if he'd say anything at all, but cooking. Cooking reminded her she was alive. When he returned, boots heavy with dust and hands coated in fence splinters, she didn't greet him, just ladled stew into a tin bowl and set it on the table. He paused at the door, eyes drifting to the clean floors, the open windows, the fire crackling in the hearth. Then, with a slight nod, he sat and ate. No words. But something shifted. That evening, as the firelight flickered against the cabin walls, she wandered into the back room, the one he hadn't pointed to, the one with the door slightly ajar, like a secret half forgotten. Curiosity tugged at her like a thread in an old quilt. Inside, the room smelled of cedar and dust. A rocking chair sat by the window, unmoved for years. On the shelf were two small wooden toys, a horse and a wagon, hand-carved. And there, on the table beside the bed, lay a faded photograph in a cracked frame. She picked it up gently. A woman smiled back at her, young, eyes kind, hair pinned neatly beneath a bonnet. Beside her stood a child, no more than 5, with the same sharp nose and quiet eyes as the man who'd brought her here. It wasn't hard to guess. Wife, daughter, gone now but not erased. She placed the photo back where she found it and left the room just as it was. Door half closed, memory preserved. Out in town, the whispers had already begun. "She'll rob him blind," said the blacksmith, spitting tobacco on the dirt. "Bet she's already turned that place into a den of sin," muttered a shopkeeper's wife. "They say she don't even talk, like a ghost with skin." No one dared say it to the rancher's face. But then again, he never gave them the chance. He hadn't been back since the day he bid for her, and the town didn't much miss his silence. But out on the ranch, something was changing. She patched the curtains with scraps of cloth from an old feed sack, picked wildflowers and placed them in a chipped glass jar on the windowsill. Repaired a broken chair with nails she found in the barn. She even coaxed a few hens back into laying, whispering to them as she scattered grain. And every night she made stew, sometimes with beans, sometimes just broth, and left it on the table. And every night he came in from whatever quiet labor he buried himself in, ate without a word, and tipped his head slightly before retreating to his corner of silence. It wasn't romance. Not yet. But it was a rhythm. And rhythm, she had learned, could be a kind of love. One afternoon, he came in earlier than usual, a limp more noticeable than before. She gestured toward the rocking chair, urging him to sit. He obeyed without argument, and for the first time, she knelt before him, pulling his boot off gently, revealing a swollen ankle, old and angry with use. She fetched cool water, dipped a cloth, and pressed it against the ache. Still, no words. But his eyes met hers, for more than a second, for more than a glance. And in them, she didn't see desire, didn't see debt. She saw grief, deep, wide, and silent as the plains. They sat like that for a long while. No music, no talking. Just the crackle of fire and the hush of two souls trying to remember what it meant to be safe. And as night fell on the broken ranch, the stars blinking awake one by one, she realized something. This place wasn't dead. It had just been waiting, for hands to heal it and a heart willing to try again. By the 4th day, the silence between them had grown comfortable, no longer heavy, just quiet, like the hush before a soft rain. The woman had taken to humming as she worked, melodies unlike anything from the West. Her songs were lilting, foreign, touched with a sadness that made the wind pause to listen. The rancher didn't ask about them, just noted the way her voice seemed to soothe the very walls of his creaking house. At first, he thought it was coincidence. But then he noticed patterns. Certain tasks she did too well for someone who'd supposedly been worthless. One morning, just before sunrise, he spotted her sitting by the kitchen window, scribbling something into a leather-bound journal. The handwriting was looping and elegant, and the words weren't English. He squinted from across the room. French. He knew enough to recognize the language from a book his wife once owned, long since packed away after the fever took her. He didn't say anything, just poured his coffee and sat across from her. She didn't flinch, didn't hide the pages. She simply shut the journal, slow and calm, like she knew her secret was safe here. Neither of them spoke. But something shifted in that moment. Something unspoken passing between their eyes. Later that day, he found her examining the broken water wheel near the barn. She ran her fingers along the wooden gears and muttered under her breath. Technical words he didn't expect, like pressure valve and hydraulic loss. He stood behind her, arms crossed, watching her with a quiet awe. She didn't look back at him, but she knew he was there. She always did. She grabbed a rusted wrench from the tool shed like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Within the hour, the wheel creaked back to life, water splashing through the trough like blood returning to a long-dead vein. He didn't speak, just nodded once and walked back inside, but not before glancing over his shoulder at her. Eyes narrowed, brow furrowed, like a man trying to solve a puzzle written in a language he never learned. That night, the fire cracked low as he sat in his armchair, watching her out of the corner of his eye. She sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching something. A bridge, maybe, or some kind of machinery. Her brow was furrowed, the charcoal pencil in her hand moving with intent. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was something else entirely. A woman with a mind sharpened by education, a past deeper than he'd guessed, and secrets that didn't quite belong in a dusty ranch far from anywhere. But he didn't ask, and she didn't offer. Silence was still their language, but now it was laced with questions neither dared to say aloud. And outside, the prairie wind carried her quiet song out into the dark. The wind shifted that morning, carrying with it the scent of trouble. It wasn't something the rancher could name outright, just a heaviness in the air, the kind that made animals restless and set the birds quiet. He'd ridden into town for supplies, expecting the usual faces and slow pace. But that day, a different kind of man stepped off the stagecoach. He wore a long, polished coat that hadn't seen dust, boots that shined like they'd been brushed just minutes ago, and gloves stitched tight around hands that hadn't worked a field in their life. His eyes were sharp, too sharp, and his voice clipped Eastern, like the kind you only heard in books or courtroom dramas. The stranger asked questions, not friendly ones, specific ones, about a woman, tall, dark hair, a scar above her brow, traveling alone, unusual education, fluent in languages. The rancher watched from across the street, standing half-shadowed in the doorway of the general store, sack of flour forgotten in his hand. He didn't need to hear everything. Just enough. The way the man carried himself, the way townsfolk started to point subtly in the direction of the ranch. One glance, and the rancher knew. The woman in his barn wasn't just someone on the run. She was being hunted. By the time he rode back home, dusk was bleeding into the sky. She was feeding the goats behind the barn, sleeves rolled up, hands dirtied from work. He didn't waste words, just rode straight up and said, "Get in the cellar." She looked at him, eyes widening, breath catching. For a second, she didn't move. Then something in his face must have convinced her, because she dropped the bucket and sprinted, behind the house. The cellar door groaned open, its hinges stiff from disuse. She climbed down without protest, but her voice rose in panic. "Is it them?" she whispered harshly. "Did someone come?" The rancher didn't answer right away. He knelt beside the cellar door, one hand gripping the handle. "Just stay quiet. Don't come out till I say." He shut the door and slid the iron latch across it. Her breath stayed with him, muffled beneath the earth. By the time the stranger arrived, it was nearly dark. His horse was sleek, not the kind used to rough terrain. Dust clung awkwardly to his coat, like a man unfamiliar with grit. He didn't bother with small talk, just looked the rancher in the eye and said, "I hear you've taken in someone." The rancher shrugged, slow and unreadable. "Plenty of strays out here. Don't ask names." The man smiled, cold, humorless. "She's not a stray. She's valuable. And she's dangerous if you don't know what you're holding." They stood in silence, the prairie stretching out behind them like a frozen ocean. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Finally, the man tipped his hat, but his words came sharp as a blade. "If you find her," he said, turning toward his horse, "she's worth more than this whole damn town." Then he rode off, his coat flapping behind him like the shadow of something still coming. Only after the dust settled did the rancher return to the cellar. He opened the door and found her huddled against the far wall, fists clenched tight, eyes wet with fury or fear, maybe both. "You saw him?" she asked. He nodded. She looked away, jaw tightening. "I never meant to bring danger here." The rancher knelt beside her, voice steady. "You didn't bring it. It was always going to find you." They sat there a while, the cellar quiet around them. Outside, the wind had picked up again, louder now, like a warning. Whatever secrets she carried, they weren't buried deep enough. And the east wasn't done looking. The night air was crisp, and the fire in the hearth had burned low, casting amber shadows across the cabin walls. She had fallen asleep curled up on the far side of the room, exhausted from a long day of tending to the animals and mending fence wire. Her breathing was soft, steady, peaceful in a way he rarely saw. But something tugged at him, a quiet question that had grown louder with each passing day. Who was she, really? Her saddlebag, battered and worn, sat near the door where she always left it. She never let it out of her sight before, always slept near it, even clutched it in her lap when strangers rode by. But tonight, for the first time, she hadn't touched it. Maybe it was trust or exhaustion, but the bag was unguarded. He hesitated. His weathered hand hovered just above the flap. He wasn't the kind of man who went looking through another's things, but ever since that man from the east had shown up asking questions, the unease in his gut hadn't let him rest. He unbuckled the strap and slowly reached inside. At first, it was just a few basic items. A silver hair comb, a worn book of poetry, a handkerchief embroidered with delicate initials he didn't recognize. But then, tucked beneath the false bottom of the bag, he found something far heavier than any of it. A velvet pouch tied in a gold cord. Inside it, he pulled out a folded piece of thick parchment sealed with wax, and a crest he didn't recognize. A royal seal. the kind he'd only seen printed in history books or whispered about by traveling drunks in saloons. He unfolded it slowly. The writing was sharp, foreign, and formal. His eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of it, but the symbols and names soon unraveled into meaning. She was the daughter of a noble house, or perhaps an heir. The letter spoke of an arranged marriage, assets to be transferred upon union, estates across oceans. But it also warned of threats, someone trying to use her for power. There was even a sketched map, one that pointed to lands in the west, properties hidden, and accounts untouched. This wasn't just a woman on the run. This was someone valuable, someone hunted. He leaned back on the wooden floor, the letter trembling in his calloused hands. He let out a long, slow breath. So she hadn't lied. She'd just stayed silent, for good reason. She stirred in her sleep, murmuring something soft in French, the syllables drifting over the room like a lullaby from another world. He looked over at her, the moonlight brushing her face, and for the first time, he didn't see a woman beaten down by the world. He saw someone who had once been cherished, protected, maybe even loved. And now, she was alone. He tucked the letter carefully back into the pouch, refolded her things with the same reverence he used to fold the flag at his brother's funeral, and slid the bag quietly back to its place. He didn't ask her about it, didn't tell her what he'd seen. She had carried the weight of that truth for so long on her own. It wasn't his to snatch away. Instead, when morning came, he was already chopping firewood. When she stepped out onto the porch, bleary-eyed and unsure, he handed her a warm mug of coffee and nodded toward the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said simply. "Best we finish the fence today?" No mention of what he knew. No change in the way he looked at her. But deep inside, something had shifted. She wasn't just a girl with secrets anymore. She was someone worth protecting. And for the first time, he wasn't doing it out of pity. He was doing it because somewhere along the way, her story had become part of his. The wind carried whispers before she ever stepped into town again. One crooked old man swore he saw a letter from the governor's own office, stamped and sealed in gold, with her name on it. A schoolteacher spotted her saddlebag, the one she used to clutch like a lifeline, now wide open with documents bearing the crest of a European house. By the time word spread to every dusty corner of the saloon, post office, and general store, it was already too late. The truth was out. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't a stray. She was a missing daughter, a woman of worth beyond the imaginations of this small, sneering town. It was the same people who once scoffed at her auction, who turned their faces when she walked by covered in dirt and silence, who now straightened their collars and practiced polite smiles. The butcher's wife, once so loud with her laughter at the rancher's fool's purchase, now baked fresh cornbread and wrapped it carefully in cloth. "Just a neighborly gesture," she said, holding it out with shaky hands. Children who once mimicked her limp now ran ahead to open gates. The sheriff tipped his hat, real slow, like he'd never looked down on her before. Dinners were offered, church seats saved. Invitations written in fine calligraphy came flowing like spring rain. But she didn't need words to reply. She walked into town square one afternoon wearing a simple blue dress, the kind that moved with the wind and caught the sun just so. Her back was straight, her eyes steady. She nodded at the invitations, took the cornbread, smiled kindly, but never once apologized for who she had been. And that silence, full of grace, full of truth, said everything they needed to hear. She didn't hold a grudge, but she didn't need their validation. They had called her worthless. Now they'd have to live with the knowledge of what they threw away. Her family came for her. In fine carriages, boots polished to shine, hands outstretched with gold and apologies. Her father, grayer and slower than she remembered, tried to repay the rancher with stacks of bills and promises of a life better lived elsewhere. "Name your price," he said, for keeping her safe. The rancher didn't blink, didn't even shift his weight. "I didn't keep her safe for a reward," he said, voice low but sure. "I did it because someone had to." It wasn't until later, when they stood alone beneath the cottonwoods near the corral, that she reached for his hand. It was the first time she touched him without needing to. No fall to break, no chore to finish, just skin and stillness. "You never bought me," she said softly, eyes fixed on the horizon where the land never seemed to end. "You saved me." He didn't speak, but she didn't need him to. The ranch, once filled with silence, was now a place where stories were understood between glances, where worth wasn't measured in coin or status, but in the way someone made you feel safe enough to become yourself again. The town might never fully atone for what it did, for the mockery, the cruelty, the blind judgment. But out on that broken ranch, a woman once discarded had found her place, not in riches or titles, but in being seen, being heard, being loved. She could have left. The world was open to her now. A family estate overseas, invitations from high places, riches she never asked for, but now had at her fingertips. There were dresses that shimmered, letters sealed with wax, and doors that would open the moment she knocked. But instead, she packed away the only dress she ever wore into town and slipped her boots back on. No announcement, no tearful goodbye, just a quiet morning, a ride through golden fields, and the familiar creak of the ranch gate swinging open again. The decision wasn't born out of obligation or pity. It was love, the kind that settles into your bones without asking for permission. She stayed, not because she owed the rancher, but because she saw herself in every broken fence, every flowerless garden, every hollowed hallway. The ranch had been silent too long, just like he had. So she got to work. The porch was mended, the cracked windows replaced with glass that caught the sunrise just right. She brought in hens and goats, mended saddles with her own hands, and turned dry patches of earth into blooming color. Her garden grew fast. Tulips and beans, squash and wildflowers. All tangled and alive, like the ranch had been holding its breath, waiting for her. The barn that once smelled of dust and regret was now full of laughter. Children from nearby homesteads began to visit. She taught them how to gather eggs and braid rope. The ranch that once kept to itself became a place where folks came to feel whole again. And through it all, the rancher stayed close, watching from a distance at first, like someone waking from a long sleep. It wasn't until one quiet evening, the sky blushing purple and the crickets just starting to sing, that he finally sat beside her on the porch and spoke. Really spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if unused for too long. "I didn't talk for years," he said, his eyes not meeting hers. "Not since my brother died." Felt like the words just disappeared. She didn't press. She just leaned against his shoulder, letting the silence stretch. Comfortable now, like a second language. It wasn't just the ranch that had been waiting to be healed. He had too. As the nights grew cooler and the stars more vivid, the two of them made a new rhythm. Mornings began with black coffee and soft laughter. Afternoons with fence mending and garden tending. And evenings, those belonged to them entirely. They would sit on that porch, her hand resting over his, a quilt over their knees, and the kind of love between them that didn't need explaining. One day, quietly and without much ceremony, he asked her to marry him. Not on one knee, not with any ring, but with a sentence as simple as the life they shared. "Stay with me as my wife." And she had nodded just once. That was enough. The town came around eventually. Not all of them, but enough to know the story had turned. They no longer called her strange or cursed. They called her Mom, with a gentleness that only comes from respect. And when folks passed by the ranch, they no longer saw an empty place, forgotten by time. They saw two figures, a man and a woman, rocking slow on the porch as the sun melted behind them. The final touch came one morning, with a hammer, a paintbrush, and a plank of wood carved with care. She nailed it to the ranch gate herself. The letters curved soft but proud. Queen's Rest. It wasn't about royalty. It was about peace. After a life of being hidden, hurt, and hunted, she had found a home that didn't ask her to be anything more than who she already was. A quiet queen, ruling not with a crown, but with compassion, courage, and a kind of love that had restored not just a place, but two people who had nearly forgotten how to live. They said she wasn't worth a penny, but to him, she was everything. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe. We tell stories that the dust of time tried to bury, but we dig 'em right back up.